Okay, let's talk about why we have such a unique model of conservation in North America. And I want to emphasize that this really is a North American model. It is not just the United States, but although the United States was definitely a driver in this model. So why are we so different? Well, mostly because of our history is what really set the stage for why we have the model that we have today. When early settlers arrived to the United States, they saw a limitless supply of natural resources of all types. And remember, they were mostly coming to the United States to flee the oppression in Europe. And so back in Europe, it was the elite that owned and could harvest the wildlife. The common person could not go and harvest any wildlife because it belonged to the landowner. And the landowner always had a lot of money. And so therefore, everyday Joes just couldn't go out and harvest any wildlife. And so they arrive in North America and they see these vast natural resources. They see forests that never end. They see flocks of birds that could block out the sun. And in their minds, that was a limitless resource. And of course, then that led to exploitation. So, ironically, the uniqueness of the North American model is due to the fact that when the first settlers arrived here, they knew that these resources were theirs for the taking. And since that time, these resources have belonged to the citizens. So we have a democratic engagement in natural resources where the people get a say in how those resources are managed. And that truly has been the case from the beginning. But it's this democratic engagement that makes us different than many nations around the world. So by 1650, let's look a little bit at this exploitation that went on. By 1650, beavers had been nearly eliminated from the East Coast. Fur was a big deal in European markets for hats. They're very fine, waterproof fur made for really nice men's hat that were water resistant. So early on, just a couple hundred years after Columbus arrives in North America, we get almost the elimination of beavers from the East Coast, which meant that they had to continue on west to search for more beaver pelts. They brought their own domestic animals, and just like the humans brought diseases, the animals brought diseases too. And so a lot of those diseases transferred over to our wild ungulates in North America, and there now became competition for grazing for wildlife. So that's something important to keep in mind for the next few hundred years. As settlers moved west and north out of Mexico, we had definite competition for grazing and definite transfer of diseases. At the time, it was thought that if we wanted more game animals, we needed fewer predators. So if we didn't have enough game animals, it must be that we have too many predators. And therefore, most predators ended up with a bounty on their head. You can see in this picture in the lower right, a bunch of either coyotes or wolves, not sure. But most states or territories or even townships offered bounties per animal, and some of them were quite high. And ironically, some states still have bounties. I believe that Colorado still has a few bounties on the books, and I'm fairly certain that Wyoming does as well. In 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was offering 1 shilling bounty for every wolf killed. And back in those times, that's a pretty sufficient amount of money. If you could go kill 10, 20 wolves, then you're making yourself a pretty good chunk of change. Most of these resources were fueling European markets. So we were shipping back pelts for the hats, as I mentioned. In 1748, South Carolina shipped, for example, 160,000 deer pelts to England. And I think it's important to mention that I've just picked a few outstanding figures here. And of course, not everything was recorded, but we do have records from some of these areas and some of these products. So most of these are just shipping records. This doesn't even mean how many were actually taken, it's just how many got shipped back to England. In 1768, the Steller's sea cow went extinct. The Steller's sea cow was similar to a manatee. So we're seeing extinctions in North America very, very early on. I should mention the Steller sea cow was probably on its way out anyway. There were a few um, sailing crews, I guess, that wiped the Steller sea cow out completely when they got shipwrecked on an island. And the Steller sea cow is a very buoyant sea mammal that would be near the surface and really easy to harvest. So this crew that got shipwrecked kind of just ate them all. In 1813, James Audubon, one of our most famous naturalists in North America, he recorded what he saw and he described things. He recorded a passenger pigeon flock estimated at 1 billion birds. And that's not unique. There were a lot of accounts in those days of these passenger pigeon flocks being so numerous that they would block out the sun. Lewis and Clark recorded abundant herds of buffalo. We'll talk later in the semester that we don't call them buffalo anymore. Grizzly and prairie dog towns that were 1 mile square. So really vast amounts of wildlife as we explored through the western United States. The Industrial Revolution caused the urban population in the U.S. to go from 5% to 20% in 1820 to 1860. Now, why is this important? Well, think about what the population, an agricultural population has to spend its time doing versus what an urban population spends its time doing. So in early days, you didn't have much spare time. If you were in agriculture, you made and produced everything you needed to survive throughout the year. And that meant working from sunup to sundown. But when you're now working in a factory, you have hours and you get a paycheck. And that means that you may have money to spare to spend on other activities, and you have time to spare. And that becomes really important because this urban shift fueled a market for wildlife to provide the urbanites with furs and feathers. So now we have our own market developing. Rather than just needing to feed the European market, we have people with extra time and extra money and extra wants. The completion of the railroad changed America in a lot of different ways, but had a really almost devastating impact on wildlife because it now created a way for us to ship products from the west to the east, and often fast enough that it wouldn't spoil. So we could now ship meat all across the United States, and we had an easy market to get those furs and feathers out of the west and back to the east where the market was strong. So what this was called, and you need to be familiar with this term, this rampant taking of wildlife to sell, not for personal use, but to sell, and usually in large quantities, is called market hunting. And this is a very different term than actual hunting. So market hunting meant you were selling everything you got for profit. It was not a sportsman's hunting that we know today. However, they are closely tied, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So a couple other interesting facts and figures. You'll see these pictures around. They're pretty famous. The one on the left and right, actually both of them are bison skulls, and so you get an idea of just how many bison were killed. And in 1865, they estimated about 1 million animals, bison being killed. But by 1871, it was 5 million. And by 1886, only 540 bison remained in the West, mostly in what will become Yellowstone National Park. 1902, I think this is supposed to be 1901 to 1902. A single market hunter sold 120,000 robins for hotels and restaurants in Texas. We don't often think about songbirds being on the menu. They still are in many parts of Europe. They just aren't as common here in the United States. In 1906, for example, 2 hunters in California recorded in their journal that they killed 218 geese in 1 hour and 450 geese for the day. And you might ask how they went about doing this, but most of these massive waterfowl harvests were because they would send rafts of dynamite out into the water into a flock of geese out on a lake or something, and then it would blow up and kill all of those geese, and then they just scoop them up out of the water, and that's how they would do it. In Iowa, a group of market hunters shot an average of 1,000 ducks per week or 14,000 ducks and shorebirds during a season. That's a lot of animals. So remember how I said that sportsmen were actually kind of tied to this market hunting. During this shift of an agricultural society, an agrarian society to a more urban society, we also get the introduction of sport hunting, of people in their spare time wanting to go out and hunt for fun. And so it was during this time in the early 1800s that sport hunting is emerging alongside the market hunting. And it didn't take too keen of an eye for these sportsmen to realize that they took a lot fewer animals than the market hunters. And if the market hunters continued in killing so many animals, there wouldn't be much left for the sport hunting, or what we'd like to call fair chase hunting. So they organized themselves and developed into hunting clubs that pushed for laws and regulations against market hunting. The first organized group was the Boone and Crockett Club, and they were responsible for pushing Congress to actually set some seasons and limits of take on animals. So the first closed season on deer, quail, and woodcock and trout was in 1848. And if you take the Colorado wildlife class, we'll learn more about how this played a role in Colorado's wildlife history, that oftentimes it was fish that were the first producers of game laws. Another key piece of conservation history, it's during this same time of rampant market hunting and bison killing that Yellowstone National Park is established in 1872. It won't be another 30 years until we have a national park system, but they were wise in setting apart this area of land to preserve the resources in that area, including wildlife. Okay, 1900, this is a really important act. It's called the Lacey Act. I'm sorry that it's getting cut off of your screen just slightly. That's the Lacey Act, and this one was incredibly important. This act basically made it illegal to transport wildlife or its parts across state lines. So what that did is if you shot 100 deer in Colorado, you couldn't ship it to the railroad in Wyoming without that being a federal crime. Therefore, you no longer had a market for all the animals that you were harvesting. So the Lacey Act basically eliminated market hunting with one fell swoop. It was a pretty brilliant piece of legislation. Another key piece that you need to know about is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1916. This is the first international piece of wildlife conservation legislation because we realized that if we protected migratory birds in the United States, it really didn't matter unless they were also protected in their breeding grounds and their nesting grounds. So this was a treaty with the United States, Canada, and Mexico to protect migratory birds from not only harvest but egg and nest collection and unregulated hunting. So this one ended market hunting for waterfowl. And one of our conservation heroes is Teddy Roosevelt, who set aside 230 million acres during his presidency from 1901 to 1909. He is one of our conservation heroes in that regard because we have so much land available for public use. And I would encourage you to look into this, as we have had in recent years some controversy on whether or not we should have so much land owned by the federal government. But go ahead and look into that as a side to this class. Okay, so wildlife as a profession. One of the things that I think is really fun to be in this career, in this major, is that this is a fairly new field as far as some fields, professions go. So wildlife as a profession really didn't get going until the 1930s, when our father of wildlife management, Aldo Leopold, published the first wildlife management textbook called Game Management in 1933. So you should be familiar with Aldo Leopold. He is a really important figure in wildlife management. He actually started out as a forester and had some life-changing encounters with wildlife that made him realize that he shouldn't just shoot every predator and that they might have to actually do something to manage ungulates other than shooting predators. He not only made the first textbook, he established the first curriculum at the University of Wisconsin, for which he made the textbook for. And so in the 1930s, research and professional societies gained significance. Leopold was also one of the founding members of the Wildlife Society, our conservation organization focused on wildlife management. I'd encourage you to get involved in either the Wildlife Society or the American Fisheries Society or the Society of American Foresters. These societies are really important for protecting our resources in North America and for networking and getting to know other professionals. And it was these organizations that pushed for having research that would actually support management decisions